Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual brown bag world language assessment, adapting to a virtual environment, presented by the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown. We're so glad you could join us this afternoon as we talk together about what assessment might look like in transitioning to virtual instruction. So welcome. We are located in Washington, D.C. and presenting remotely from our homes here. So if you could type in the chat box where you're located or the question box, we'd love to say hello and know where everyone is joining us from today. So you can add that information into the question box there that you see on your screen. And I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Meg Montee. I serve as the Associate Director of the AELRC, and I also work as the Director of Performance-Based Language Assessment at the Center for Applied Linguistics, where I work on a variety of projects related to world language assessment and English language assessment, and particularly specialize in oral proficiency assessment. And I'll pass things off to my colleague, Meg Malone, to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Meg Malone, and I'm the Director of the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center at Georgetown. I'm really happy to have you all here, and it's nice to virtually meet you. Should we go on to the next slide, Meg? I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center. We are a Title VI Language Resource Center, and we are directed collaboratively by researchers at Georgetown, at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and at ACTFL. And our primary mission is to facilitate useful assessment and evaluation practices. And our purpose is to help world language educators like you innovate and improve their programs, which a lot of you are innovating minute by minute right now, ensuring accountability to students and society, and to articulate the value of world language studies in the world today.
Great. Thanks, Meg. I'm going to go over just a little bit of housekeeping as we get started. So when you came into the webinar, you were automatically muted, and computer audio should be selected. If you're having trouble hearing, you can enter things into the question box, and our team will try to respond. But we ask that you keep your mics on mute during the presentation. And if you do have questions or comments, you can enter those into the box that says questions. And those will become visible to our moderators. We have Jamie and Valentina from the AELRC working with us to respond to you. And then at the end, they'll read some of your questions out loud so that we can respond to issues or comments that you would like to bring up. But for today, we're going to keep all of our participants on mute and use that question box to respond to your comments. And with that, I will pass things off to the other Meg.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit about our goals for the workshop, or the brown bag. I'm imagining that you're all eating your lunches, and I'm looking forward to eating mine. So the first thing we're going to do is discuss practical and effective assessment for virtual instruction. Many of you have just been thrown into this virtual instruction atmosphere, and we're just going to talk about some tips for assessing your students via virtual instruction without, specifying any particular platform that you're using. And we also really want to provide support for you in adapting your practices to the current realities. You all are just doing a tremendous job with without a lot of pre-planning, and we just want to give you some practices that might help. So what are we going to talk about today? The first thing we want to do is find out more about you and to share a little bit about all of your all's background with each other. We're going to give some background on assessment and what it is. We do a lot of work on assessment at Georgetown, and one issue that frequently comes up is that we all have different definitions of assessment. So we're going to develop a shared definition for this workshop. We're going to talk about planning for assessment. And then we're going to talk about making adjustments, which is really what all of our lives seem to be about right now. And then at the end, we will have a moderated Q&A. And what we found out is that you're teaching a lot of different languages. This is really exciting to us because in addition to supporting all world languages, the AELRC has a particular focus on less commonly taught languages. So you see all these languages listed. Arabic, Meg Montee and I have done so many projects in Arabic. Chinese, English, German, Hindi and Urdu, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese. This is great. We see that there are a lot of languages being taught remotely, which is wonderful. And the levels, it seems that you come from all levels, from K-12 to higher education to adult education. And then we also asked, what kind of language proficiency frameworks do you use for teaching and assessing in your classrooms? And we find that some of you use ACTFL, others ILR, the Common European Framework for Reference, and some various English language proficiency frameworks, whether they're for K-12 or post-secondary or adult education. And about 2/3 of you are currently teaching online. So we really hope that this is helpful for you. Your needs. One of the things we asked is, what are your immediate needs? And one of the first needs is to adapt materials for this online instruction, especially paper and pencil tests. A lot of us rely on a lot of paper and pencil tests, and obviously you can't do that when you're remote. And next is to think about changing your assessment plans. Do I have to give a test? Or, thinking about what your concept of a test is and adjusting it to this new reality. A third question is how to monitor your students during online assessment, since you're not there to walk around the classroom or see what they're doing. And finally, one of your needs, and of course you have others, is to motivate your student engagement. I'm teaching an online class at Georgetown right now for students who were evacuated from study abroad, and it really is hard to motivate students to be engaged and to participate and interact when they're spending all these hours online with Zoom and Teams and all these other things, while trying to often share devices with other people and their families, and trying not to get too much screen fatigue, as many of us have. So let's look at some other needs that you said you had. One thing, I love how this is in all caps, simple and practical ideas for assessment. Simple and practical. Simple and practical is the most important thing in assessment, because if it's too complicated, it's not just hard to administer and score, it's hard for your students to understand what they're supposed to do. And practical, you all are already working really hard, and we want to make sure that we give you ideas that don't involve you spending hours and hours more than you're already doing. And what I love about this response too is that you talked about them being appropriate for your students' level. A lot of people are sharing stuff online, which is great, but we also want to make sure that we're adapting things for the appropriate level, whether it's age or proficiency level or focus of the class, and your current instructional format. And then some specific issues that came up were performance-based language assessment, especially speaking, and dealing with disruptions and technology challenges, which seem to be the hallmark of all of our days right now. So we're just going to start with a few definitions of assessment. So in the chat box, I'm going to give you 1 minute. In fact, I'm going to time it. I'm going to put a timer on my phone. If you could type one word that comes to mind when you think of assessment, I'm going to give you a minute to type it. So please type it in. Okay, so you can hear my Stargaze message. Oh, got to shut that off. And some of the things that people said were things like test, which is another thing that comes to mind when assessment, stress, time, outcomes, and results. So these are all words that are associated with assessment. So let's look at the next part and see what we said about assessment. And so we really think of assessment as a way that we gather information about our students' language. And I think this makes assessment seem less scary and more friendly. We're just getting information to see how these clear objectives that we set in assessment have been reached, and getting information to determine the progress that students have made toward these objectives. And then it's also an opportunity to provide feedback about language development to students. So one thing I like to think about, one of the great things about language is very often there aren't right answers, right? We're just moving on a trajectory toward proficiency. And so it's not like, math or science where there is a, one right answer, but there are many, many ways that students can show what they know. So one of the two key questions that come up for assessment, and there are a lot of important questions, but these are the really critical ones that are, what do I want to know? So what is it that I want to get out of this assessment? And then how will I use this information? And one of the things Meg Montee often quotes is Coco Chanel, which is, you put on all of your accessories and then you take them all off but one. So you really want to focus on, what do you want to know about your students? What is the most essential thing? And then what are you going to do with the information? Okay, so let's look at the one. So how do you plan for assessment during virtual instruction? So we have a few things that we need to focus on. And the first is, what are the current realities I need to account for in my assessment plan? Do all the kids have a Chrome or a laptop or what have you? What are realistic instructional goals now? I think a lot of people talk about our current situation as being a reset, and I think this is a reset not just personally, but professionally. What is realistic to achieve in a language course? And also, what are your priorities? What decisions do I need to make about my students? And what information do I need so that I can make these decisions? And then finally, what are the tools and resources I have available to collect the information and also to document it so that you can provide feedback? So let's look at some of these issues. So let's start with the current technology, current realities. The first, of course, is, what technology do my students have access to? And I bet with, there are 72 people on this webinar besides the four of us, and I bet you have 72 different answers for what technology your students have access to. And it differs sometimes even within one teacher. And the issue of how reliable is it? Not just the technology, but the connection. We had a big windstorm here a few weeks ago, and I remember some people's power and connection was knocked out. It had nothing to do with the pandemic, but it did have to do with the current situation. Another issue that I really want to stress for all of you is, how much time can we spend on instruction and assessment in total and during a teaching session? So what's the time limit? Some of you are teaching concurrently online, face-to-face. Some of you are doing all asynchronous, and there's a lot in between. And I also want you to think about, what are your students and your own social and emotional needs? How can we meet these needs via class, and what needs aren't being met? And so what we want to encourage you to do is to keep assessment simple, flexible, and aligned with instructional goals and practices. And this is actually no different than what we tell you to do when you're not unexpectedly teaching online. But unexpectedly teaching online gives you an opportunity to really think about what you're doing and why, and how to focus it. So the next question is, what are realistic instructional, could you go back for a second? Instructional goals right now, and what are your priorities? So let's think about that. So one of the first things you want to do is align your instruction and assessment. And I know that sounds really straightforward, but I can't tell you how many times I go in and find out that the assessment that's being used doesn't match the instruction. And so you really want to make sure that your assessment reflects instructional goals and practices. If your students are if students are speaking a lot in class, of course you should be assessing that. On the other hand, if you've cut back on that because you're doing a lot of asynchronous, you would want to cut back on the amount of speaking assessment you're doing. You also might need to adjust your expectations for student outcomes. Not only have you been teaching online, but this is, a very serious and difficult situation. Students' focus might not be there. There may have been interruptions in various of your curricula because of retooling to get ready to go online, or because students are, at hotspots in the pandemic. So really to think about what are your expectations for your students, and do you need to adjust those? And so I'm going to give you a sample language goal for intermediate level, and this is the ACTful intermediate level, not necessarily intermediate, a course that's called intermediate. And so let's look at this. Students will be able to express opinions and feelings about familiar topics using original sentences and ask and answer follow-up questions. So that's pretty straightforward. You see the me in intermediate. It's all about familiar topics. Okay. So let's make this a little bit more specific here. Some of you are doing online group conversations. So in these conversations, we would adjust this to say, students will be able to express opinions and feelings about familiar topics using original sentences and ask and answer follow-up questions. And you see in little boxes, do I need to adjust expectations for the quantity and quality as a course outcome? Is it different online than it was in class because you can't monitor all of them at once? And you might want to think about, should I provide a sentence starter so that if you put students in small groups or pairs to talk, you help them start it off because you're not there to, stare at them until they start participating. And so think about, how do you get that started? And then this issue of appropriate video chat conversation etiquette, one thing we'd like to point out is this is an opportunity for new skills, right? Because these are really important skills, as we've all figured out in the last 5 to 7 weeks, and may allow you to look at conversational etiquette, particularly within a particular language and culture. Another issue that often comes up is prioritization. Very often, I think, especially when I'm teaching, I want to assess everything, but we can't assess everything because we spend X amount of time teaching and learning and we have limited time for assessment. So we want to think about what's the most important for the context and think about both your specific course and the whole program. So if you're teaching in a high school Spanish 2, what will you need the students to be able to do so that they can enroll in third level next year? If you're teaching at the university level and you're teaching a final year course, what's the most important skills that your students will need before they head off to the workforce? So think about that. And I think also to understand your students' priorities. We should always understand these and take them into account, but this is a really hard time to get students motivated and engaged. So really looking at ways to support simple and effective assessment that reflect your goals. And now I'm turning this back over to you, right, Montee?
That's right. Yeah, thanks, Meg. So Meg Malone went through the first 2 questions here, really looking at developing a realistic understanding of your current context and how, when we talk about virtual instruction, I think today we're really talking about virtual instruction during a pandemic, when things are changing quickly and we're adapting the best that we can. And so just like any type of assessment we do, the first thing we want to look at is a rich understanding of context, and then to set realistic instructional goals for those and to prioritize those. And the virtual mode may shift some of the instructional goals that we have, may expand them in new ways to include new and different skills, but it's an opportunity to prioritize what we can realistically and meaningfully instruct and assess during this time. So from there, I'm going to go back to what Meg talked about as kind of the fundamental definition of assessment that we look at, which is understanding assessment as collecting information in order to make decisions. And I hope that when we talked about what is the definition of assessment, that this is actually very freeing for you. Because I think when we talk about assessment, probably for many of you, the first word that comes up is test, right? In order to assess it, I need to test it. But if we see assessment as a process of collecting information about learning and language development in order to apply it for decision making, then I think it opens up a lot more possibilities, and it frees us from some ways of thinking that really might not be that helpful right now, given the current context. So we're returning to these two questions again. If you ever come to any professional development from the AELRC, you will see these as the foundation of all the work that we do with both formative classroom assessment as well as summative assessment. So what do I want to know? What's my purpose? And what decisions am I going to make? How will I use this information? And I want to give you a scenario where we can see how this would play out. So let's say you're a language instructor and your course typically culminates in an extended final exam of all 4 language skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And you are able to assess speaking through face-to-face interviews with your students according to a proficiency scale. And you might wonder, okay, that's what I've done for many years, and now I'm teaching virtually. I'm ending the semester. Should I change this assessment? If I have a 4-skill final exam, how will I proctor this test? Do I even have the resources and the time to assess all of my students over video? And other questions might be, how will this final exam, if I have it, affect my students emotionally? Will it motivate them? Can I make sure they're not cheating, right? Those are the kinds of questions you might have. So I want to talk about these 2 questions of assessment purpose and assessment use for this situation, for this kind of hypothetical language instructor. Because I think going through the process of answering them may help you kind of open up to new possibilities. So you might, think, okay, my informational needs are, I really need to know how my students are progressing toward programmatic proficiency targets. Maybe you have particular outcomes that you expect students to achieve. And so you do need some information about if that's happening, right, or where they are. And also kind of understanding that might not be the same as it was before in terms of progress, because instructional time has shifted. You may also want to know, I'm really interested in speaking ability. That feels really important to me as an instructor, and it's very important in my program. So I want to know how they're doing in that area. And you would also potentially want to know, is my instruction effective? Are my students learning what I expected them to? Right? Are they achieving those course outcomes? And then you can think about the informational use for this scenario. Well, you would want to be documenting student progress, giving students feedback, and potentially assigning grades based on that final exam, and then also an evaluation of your own course outcomes. So there's some internal review need there. So going back to this scenario, we might say, you know what, when I look at this, my typical practice of giving a final exam and then my informational needs right now, you might say, you know what, I think I can really gather that information in some new, simple, and flexible ways. And maybe I can prioritize speaking. I might not have the capacity to do a full assessment of all 4 skills in terms of a final exam, but I might say I'm going to prioritize speaking right now. And I think I can get that in some group video chats or perhaps a project-based scenario. And that will still give me sufficient information to make those decisions that I need to make without requiring a final exam or an extended test, as I did in the past. But it's really, when people ask, do I still have to give tests? What's appropriate? The first thing to do is really to take stock of these 2 questions and to think about what's going to be sufficient for my needs, as well as what's practical right now. And that goes back to Meg Malone's point about prioritization. So really, what are those specific priorities for your context and needs? And I want to tie this into the notion of validity for a moment, which is really, we talk about that as aligning the tools that you need with those questions of purpose and use. So it's the appropriateness of the assessments. And it relates to how well they match. Does the intended purpose for that test or assessment and match how you're using it? And is that information you collect sufficient for the use? So you can imagine that you might have multiple ways to assess speaking, right? And they may be, varying quality, but you could assess speaking through extended oral interviews, through observation of classroom conversations or virtual conversations. But then you might be making different decisions based on those assessments. One assessment might be an exit criteria for a program, in which case you would want to have more formality and rigor to the assessment. And another purpose might be planning instruction, in which case a more informal assessment tool is completely appropriate. So it's both what you're measuring, but also making sure that it's sufficient to those decisions. And we're really asking during COVID-19, how can I gather sufficient information through these creative or less formal approaches? And some things you might think about, are there ways that I can add documentation to instructional activities in order to gather some systematic information about how my students are doing? One thing that I tell teachers a lot, we ask, are you assessing your students virtually? And they say no. But I think that teachers are always assessing their students. That's part of being a good language instructor. You're always taking in information about what they're doing and adjusting to it. And so sometimes adding assessment into your practice is just a matter of formalizing some documentation. And I'll give an example in a moment of what that might look like. But it can mean that you don't have to create an entirely new assessment, but that you can add an assessment component into what you're doing. And particularly related to the assessment of speaking and writing and performances, sharing those rubrics and tools with students can powerfully shape their learning when done both before and after assessment. It's an opportunity to demonstrate to students what they can do, to make your expectations explicit to them, and really it makes the assessment fair to the students because they know what they're being measured on, what they're being graded on, potentially. And as I move on from this, I just want to tie this in also to the social and emotional needs of our students and also our own needs right now. Just keeping in mind that high pressure or formal exams may not be what your students need right now. And I think one important goal that we have as language instructors is motivating our students for future study and keeping them engaged and interested. And so I think that also is an important consideration when you think about what is the right assessment choice for my course at this time. And I did want to take a moment to talk about online proctoring and cheating. Meg Malone, I know you have some more experience here, so I welcome you to chime in if there's anything you'd like to add. But even in person, exams are not, perfectly secure in terms of keeping students from cheating or taking the test in ways that that you don't envision. So I would strongly encourage you at this time to just consider alternatives to tests that require proctoring and monitoring. I know there are digital tools out there, and some of those may be appropriate given your program needs if you do need to use this kind of test. But I think probably for many of us, a better question is, what are the programs and tools that I'm already using instructionally that I could also use for assessment? Because this allows us to be efficient, and it keeps our students from needing to learn new systems, which I know right now feels sometimes overwhelming to me when I have to think about a new platform, a new video chat component. So just as much as possible, using the same tools for instruction and assessment. And then thinking about how can I embrace authenticity in student language and really encourage them to show what they can do. So that we can, oh yeah, please go ahead, Meg.
Yeah, I did a webinar that really talked about this last week, and I just want you to think about how long it takes for students to stop making errors, patterned errors, and start only making mistakes, and to think of this as a time to communicate with your students that what you really want to hear is their language develop, and not for them to be sitting in a room re-recording until they have the passé composé completely perfect, but instead, that was a little joke there, passé composé and perfect, little language joke, but also to think about what are the mistakes they should be making and keeping track of, and to add opportunities for students to assess themselves and their progress.
Yeah, I think, Meg, that just makes me think that assessments are always powerful ways to communicate to our students what we value. And I think it can communicate to them the value of authenticity, of language performance and authentic use, and also of trust. And that we see them as people right now. I know I appreciate just in my life when people have communicated that in different contexts, that they understand that we're whole people and we bring those whole selves into our learning situations. And there are times when our instructional and assessment choices need to adapt to those. Okay, and so in the last part, I'm going to touch briefly on tools and resources for information collection and documentation. And what I find often is that teachers often know better technology tools and sort of the specifics of things that are neat and interesting to use. So we're focusing on this more at a higher level than necessarily specific recommendations. But if you do have any specific recommendations or comments about what you use, please enter those in the question box. We'd love to hear from you about those. So again, I made this point earlier, but keeping your assessment and your instructional tools as consistent as possible will be helpful for students so that their experience is streamlined. And it will make your life easier and better as well. And then I think the one kind of really wonderful tool that we would say, use as much as possible are any proficiency frameworks that you have. ACTFL, ILR, the Common European Framework of Reference we mentioned earlier, or English proficiency tools. These can help you collect information about things that you're doing in instruction or as separate assessment activities. And it gives you a common language for talking about those student skills and abilities that also make it easier for you to communicate to other instructors who might be taking over in the future in a course of a program, or also communicating to students meaningfully about their skills and abilities in ways that translate into real-world proficiency. So I just want to give you a quick example of what this might look like. Meg Malone talked about the scenario earlier of an online group chat for developing kind of intermediate level, actual intermediate level speaking. And so if you were planning on having group video chats as part of your instruction, you might decide to develop a simple checklist to use with your students where you can kind of gauge where they are according to your goals. And so you see here some criteria that I've chosen. These could vary according to what's important to you. But I think I wanted to include video chat skills here. So using mute and unmute effectively. This is a really wonderful skill, and digital learning environments give us a chance to build those explicitly with students. So I think it's great whenever we can capture those emerging skills and abilities for a virtual communication and empower students to show them that that's part of language and that is a component of proficiency. And here I've used this checklist in a more diagnostic way, right? I might say simply yes or no for students, or I might note where they're having difficulty. Student A maybe needs some support to use video technology well. I included a little bit about quantity of language. I think that's something I can usually pay attention to in video chats. Are those students producing, a couple oral sentences? And you can note maybe, a student C is falling a little bit short of that goal, right? They're giving short phrases with formulaic structures. So this is giving me information about my students' proficiency that I can then use to adapt my instruction and to understand where they are in terms of proficiency targets. I might also want to know about vocabulary and make some notes about comprehensibility. So is that student, as in student A, maybe there's some fluency issues there that could use some focused work. So that's just one example of a simple tool that you can develop, particularly effective if you derive those descriptors from your proficiency frameworks that you're using. But I think there's also scenarios where we do want to quantify things for our students and potentially for grading. So something like this simple checklist could be used. This example one is kind of a more diagnostic way to use it. I might not even tell my students that I'm taking these notes. It could just be internally for me. But I might want to have a checklist that I use that is going to give some quantifiable information. And maybe I want to share that with students, or it's going to help me with grading. And so I can take these same categories of features that I'm looking for, and I can assign some simple numeric values. In this example, I've just done from 0 to 2 for each one. And I can say 0, okay, no evidence, or the student does not meet expectations for this particular feature. I can say a 1, well, it's generally okay. The student may need a little bit of extra support in doing this. And then a 2 might be strong, right? The student can do this well, they can do it independently. And this still gives me good diagnostic information, but also allows me that the ability to quantify that. Okay. Well, that is the end of the information that we've provided for you, and we wanted to leave some time at the end for your questions and comments, because we know that the practical challenges that you're dealing with right now are varied and could require or elicit some good discussion. So Jamie and Valentina have been moderating the questions in the chat box, and they're going to read out some of the questions so Meg Malone and I can respond. Okay.
If anybody has any questions, feel free at this point to enter them into the chat box, or I'm sorry, the question box, and we will read them as they come.
Okay, yes, thank you all. I should have given that instruction. Please do enter your comments and questions into the chat box.
So on a scale of 0 to 2, Meg, how would you rate your giving of directions for that?
Oh, I think, let me go back to my scale. I'd probably give myself a 1. It was adequate, but I needed some support from Valentina there. So, you know, that's the thing about translating things to virtual environments often takes a lot of practice. I found that myself, and things that would be natural and clear face-to-face, just have to think a little bit differently in a virtual environment. So it's a good reminder.
It's good for everyone to always have support.
And two, it shows how Meg did need that support from We did not plan this, by the way, everybody who's on the line, but what's interesting is that if we had been in person, one of us probably would have, you know, touched Meg on the arm and said, don't forget to tell people to write their questions on a sticky that they can pass forward at the end. And so sometimes our students need support, and sometimes we as instructors need support to remind our students to do the things that they need to do so we can assess them.
Okay, so we have a couple questions coming in. I'll start from the top. Are there standardized online measurements for language assessment, meaning online tests to evaluate language acquisition?
Yes, one resource that we can point you to, and I'll ask Jamie to add this into the chat box for everyone, is the Foreign Language Assessment Directory, which is a project that's funded by the AELRC and is hosted on the Cal website. And it's an online searchable directory of information about standardized tests that you can look for things in and then contact the test publisher. So I think that would be one of the main resources to look at for things you can use, and they should indicate if they're online or not, or you can ask the publisher. And we just updated that, so the information should be correct and accurate in that.
And Meg, let me just say, figure out what test you want and contact the publisher. A lot of tests that were previously proctored by humans in the same space are now being offered online during COVID-19. So yes, there are a lot of resources available, and frankly, a lot more are available online through different proctoring methods than used to be.
Okay, we have another. What other testing, in quotations, options would you recommend for listening?
Do you want me to take that, Meg, and then you can jump in?
That'd be great, thanks.
One of the things I really like about online for listening is that it's different from being in the classroom, because your students, they can respond in so many different ways. So for example, you could, you know, if you have all of the copyright, you could live stream part of a video during class and stop it and ask students to send you, you know, you could ask them to summarize what was being said. You could have pre-written questions that you ask them. And this is a way that you can really find out how each individual student is doing on listening. One of the issues with playing a video or anything oral in class is that if, you know, that smarty pants Meg Montee answers right away, everybody nods. This way you can find out how all the students are understanding the video and not just the students who you know are understanding it. So that's one thing. Another thing is, so you can play something and ask questions about it, especially at the lower levels. I recommend breaking any video or speech sample into smaller bits so that they're not listening to 10 or 20 minutes and then you're asking them questions, but you're stopping it regularly to see, did you understand what was going on? This is also an opportunity to bring culture into the mix, to say, you know, you listen to that, what was the point of it? Well, what was the culture that was going on behind it? You know, why did this series of events happen? Anything to add there, Montee?
Well, I think that's great. I do see a comment about going back to the checklist, so I'm going to scan to that while we continue to answer questions.
Okay, I've got a quick one here. Is it okay to change the weight of the final exam? I figured I had to stick to what is stated in the syllabus, but I would like to make it way less in favor of a final project, etc.
I think those questions are all about communicating with your students and using it as an opportunity to help students and not penalize them. First of all, if you're at a school where you have oversight from a dean or a department chair or other people in your department, you should definitely communicate with them so you don't get into trouble. But I would say just being straightforward with your students and saying, look, I really want to weight your final project more because you can work on that offline and you can submit it, you can submit your work not in live time, whereas if the exam is in live time, you know, I'm concerned that people have differing amounts of literal bandwidth to complete it. So I would say a lot of it is about communicating with your students and making sure that they understand what's weighted how.
I have a good follow-up question to that. How would you suggest talking to faculty about the benefits of rethinking assessment in asynchronous formats? The faculty I support are very reluctant to do this and have said they plan to just use Zoom for instruction and assessment if we will be teaching remotely in the fall.
I think some of this, I'm gonna talk about this relationship-wise and substance-wise, and a little bit about process. Right now, I think a lot of people are are just trying to get across the finish line. I know in a lot of ways, I have a 12-month position, so my finish line is infinite. But in terms of my own children who are in school, I think they're really focused on, you know, getting through the semester, and I think a lot of our instructors are too. So I would say it doesn't have to be either or. You can say, what are some, I would reframe it to say, how could you use asynchronous learning to make your workload more manageable? Because things like writing samples, you know, there's a lot of things, as you mentioned, that you can do asynchronously that will save time and energy. So I would encourage you to think about it as asking your faculty how this will work for them. And I hear a little frustration in your voice. I think that's really normal that we're all working. What is it I tell Meg every time I talk to her? I'm working twice as hard and doing half as much, and I'm 4 times as tired, which is not real math. And also to see what resources are available. Every institution has different levels of resources, and figuring out what's realistic. I hope that helps. Montee, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think it can be challenging, you know, implied in that question, I think, is you're dealing with a view of assessment kind of as a must-do rather than a rich source of information, and so, you know, something that can be very helpful for instruction. And so, you know, some of that often deals with the underlying ideologies that people bring to those discussions as well. So that's why we really promote this idea of information and use as being the framework through which to view assessment. Okay, I think we probably have time for one final question.
Okay, I have one that's a bit broader, more abstract, and then one that's a bit more practical. And actually, it refers to the slide that you're on right now, so I might go ahead and do that one. This one is, how do you translate the 0-1-2 checklist into a grade?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, because it's hard. where we want information about student proficiency and development, and not sort of saying, oh, you're penalized for being at a different point on a trajectory, or meeting this target is equal to an A. But understand that grading is an important part of instruction for many of us. And so, I think about often assigning grades based on participation and effort, and incorporating that into something like this. And then perhaps you provide the information about some of the language development components in a more formative, feedback-driven way that can help motivate students for learning, while not penalizing them for skills that they may be working on, with effort, but may just not have achieved yet. So it's not that we'd say, oh, a score of 10 equals this grade, in this example, but rather those are the considerations that I would take into account, and may add in those additional participation factors. But it may be that, I spent time instructionally on video skills, and would want to weight that in my grading, because I've expected students to achieve and practice that for this particular example. Yeah, Meg, anything to add on grading?
I mean, one thing about grading and proficiency is, there should always be a range in your class. We don't have homogeneous classes in general. Oftentimes we have students at varying levels of proficiency, and there's variation even within one level of proficiency. So you should always be thinking about, what's the range that I'm going to see, and then how do I grade that range, And also, I like to look at how students progress. A student who starts off, as a barely at the intermediate mid-level, at the end of a year might not have changed levels, but might have really gained in a lot of language. So really think about it as what's the range that you're looking at in your class, and how to grade that.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are at time. One thing I've learned in giving presentations is that things are better in a virtual environment if they're a little bit shorter than they are in a face-to-face environment. So we hope that you have one or two takeaways that you will be able to apply to your context. And my hope is one thing you take away is that it's okay for assessment to be simple and flexible right now, and to really focus on instructional alignment, both in the tools and the avenues that you use for assessment, but also in what and how you are assessing in terms of language development. And we really think that that is something that will make assessment effective, informational, and motivating for your students right now. But I've just continued to be blown away by the instructors and teachers that I know, and their incredible commitment and flexibility and adaptability to how things are changing. So just want to give you all a hand and congratulate you on making it through another week of isolation and quarantine, and hope that you are all safe and well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And finally, I'll just say we will post this on our website for everyone to access. So check out the AELRC's website at Georgetown for this presentation in the future. All right, thank you, everyone.